What factors led to the rapid increase in industry in Minnesota in the last half of the 1800s? In a lot of ways, what's going on in Minnesota during this time period, sort of the time period after the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century, is mirroring what's going on a nationwide scale in sort of the last half of the 1800s. And it's sort of a confluence of many different events that are going to lead to a lot of changes in the country and the state. And some of this is going to be due to sort of the repercussions of the Civil War era and time period, as well as the era of pressuring American Indians for land and finding ways, whether through treaties or pressure or violence, to take that land from American Indians. And that's sort of where we're going to start here. Sort of one factor, of course, that's going to lead to that is that simply the acquiring of the land by Euro-Americans sort of opened the door for industries to start sort of snatching up large portions of that land and trying to then profit off of it, and sort of using it to fuel the rest of this sort of industrial drive. That's going to be combining with a number of other elements. You have the Homestead Act, which was enacted slightly before the Civil War, during the Civil War, actually, I believe, that is going to be essentially opening up vast tracts of land for settlement in the western portions of the United States. So you have lots and lots of land available, lots of people flocking westward to claim these portions of land, which is essentially going to be free as long as you find a way to develop it. And a lot of people are trying to sort of start their own version of what you might consider the American dream, getting their own land, setting up a small farm, and working that land to sort of support themselves and their families. So a lot of people are moving into the state, as we saw sort of through the period of statehood. That period that really doesn't stop during the Civil War, but sort of is checked to a certain degree just because there's so much else that's going on, but that immigration and emigration to the state is going to rapidly expand during this time period. So the population of the state is going to be very much increasing. Like I said, the end of the Civil War in a lot of ways sort of sparked a yearning on a lot of people's part to sort of move past those divisions, which were going to be that was going to be a lot sort of easier and said and done by some people, particularly white Euro-Americans, than other people who were still being sort of negatively impacted. Just because the Civil War ended didn't mean that racism went away, and in a lot of ways, racism becomes even worse in the North during that time period following the Civil War. We'll be talking a little bit more about that here in a few weeks. But there was a sense by Euro-Americans that they wanted to sort of definitely, now that sort of question about slavery in their view had sort of been solved, and that sort of tension point between the governments and the governments of the state governments and the federal government and whatnot had been more or less sort of settled for the time being, that they wanted to very much sort of expand. This is going to also be coinciding with a massive uptick in people immigrating from overseas, people immigrating from Europe, from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, and there's going to be a huge immigration boom. The entire sort of immigration story that a lot of people think about comes from this time period. Massive amounts of people loading up on steamships, coming over the Atlantic Ocean, going through Ellis Isle. That is all very much sort of typified by this late 1800s time period. So there's going to be a real influx of new people into the state, immigrants coming from locations that they had never come from before. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that next week, looking at sort of some of the impacts that that's going to have on the state. But that's going to be one thing that is definitely going to sort of lead to the increase in industry, is the increase in available labor, which is essentially going to be, from a certain degree, sort of inexhaustible through much of this period, which is going to be very good for industry, but not necessarily good for the workers, as we'll be discussing in a moment here, the people who are going to actually sort of be doing this work. So certainly the massive spike in population is a huge impact. This is also sort of part of the story of westward expansion in general, how increasing those Euro-American peoples throughout this time period were either sort of completing that process of acquiring land from American Indians, or had already sort of finished that process, and trying to sort of find every possible way to utilize, might be one way to say it, exploit might be another way to say it, the natural environments and natural resources of the interior of the continent was definitely a high priority for a lot of individuals, and it just also sort of so happens to coincide with a lot of technological improvements that are happening through sort of the ongoing process of industrialization. Increase in steam power, the quality and availability of steel, the availability of sort of mass-produced parts for machinery. All of this is going to have a very large impact on the industries that do form in Minnesota and their relative success. Also, because this is a process that's going on across the nation, not just in Minnesota, there is an incredibly huge demand for these resources that are going to be found in Minnesota, whether it's the lumber from the timber industry, whether it is food in the form of wheat and the flour milling industry, whether it's the iron and the iron ore industry. This is all going to be incredibly high demand as essentially, the country is expanding at an incredibly rapid rate, and there's going to be pretty much no limit to how much of these goods you could produce and sell at a price that's going to fetch you really a lot of money. And all of these various sort of events and processes are going to be fueling off each other. The expansion, the population boom, the technology, all of this is going to sort of create that insatiable demand for these industries. So it's very much sort of a lot of things coming together to sort of create a perfect storm for Minnesota to be very much sort of the center and in a lot of ways kind of an archetype for what you see happening on a national stage. So what were the main industries that arose or expanded in the state during this time period, and why did these particular industries see so much growth? Yeah, so I thought the class did a very good job of breaking a lot of these down. One of the first big industries was farming, right? We talked about originally sort of the impact that the Homestead Act had, and how there was a creation of a lot of small farms, people started going out to try to create family farms. But at the same point in time, you had sort of the industrialization of farming occurring in Minnesota, the sort of so-called bonanza farms. The Red River Valley was particularly prevalent with these type of farms, where you would have essentially sort of corporate interests buying up land, having fleets of horses, the most advanced sort of farming machinery that they could buy, and producing massive quantities of primarily wheat, sometimes sugar beets as well. And that sort of farming definitely is one of the big hallmarks. Sort of flowing right from farming then was the flour milling boom, particularly in Minneapolis. And a lot of people pointed out the sort of efforts of Cadwallader Washburn, the sort of invention of finding ways to make spring wheat not just profitable but incredibly high quality. So the middlings purifier, the gradual reduction process, the use of steel rollers, the increased use of ventilation technology. All of this leads to essentially Minnesota becoming one of the largest flour producers, not just in the country, but in the entire world. So the flour milling becomes incredibly important to the economy of Minnesota. The expansion of the lumber industry. One of the sort of just natural resources that Minnesota had that was very, very valuable were white pine, particularly, sometimes jack pine, but essentially forests and trees that were incredibly tall, very, very straight, that produced very high quality wood. It also had a very advantageous natural environment, a lot of rivers to essentially cut down these logs, these trees to create logs, ship the logs down rivers to the sawmills, which would then saw those logs into boards, and then be able to ship those into these very large rivers like the St. Croix, the St. Louis, or the Mississippi, and bring them to a place where they could be put onto ships, for example, either in Duluth or in along the Mississippi, and then sent out from Minnesota to essentially either being used in Minnesota in sort of the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Stillwater, the largest sort of growing towns there, or out of state as well, to St. Louis, to Chicago, to Pittsburgh, to these cities which were also, just like Minnesota, rapidly growing and rapidly expanding. So the lumber industry becomes very, very influential And of course, the expansion of the railroad is only going to help with that process. The fact that you could then log year round, not have to essentially depend on rivers to carry those logs. Once you could just essentially run a railroad site out to large tracts of forest, put the forest, the logs directly on that truck, or not the truck at this point in time, the train car, ship those then to those various areas. It becomes just even more profitable for the lumber industry. The mining industry, discovery of particularly iron ore becomes incredibly important. And the iron at this point in time, because of the expansion of these various forms of technology, because of the importance of steel, really this iron is going to be fueling the expansion of this across the United States in general. As the video points out, it's responsible for highways and bridges and stadiums, vehicles, electric lines. Once the United States becomes engaged militarily around the world, fueling the war efforts, and really the iron from the Iron Range and the resources there help the United States sort of become the industrial powerhouse that it's going to become. Sort of beginning with this second half of the 1800s into the early 1900s. So by the time the country needs to sort of militarize itself for the First World War, it's going to be in a strong position then to do that, partially because of how industrialized the country was able to become, and a lot of that was based upon sort of those raw materials, part of which are going to be coming right here from Minnesota. And of course, the one thing that's going to tie all these other industries together is the railroad. Making travel and transportation cheaper and easier, and in a lot of ways enhancing all of these industries. It's going to be easier for farmers to get their products to the mills or to the markets. It's going to make those milling companies able to receive a lot more wheat in order to turn into flour and then to ship that flour back out. Same thing with lumbering and mining. It's going to make sort of the transportation of those very sort of heavy, cumbersome products that they're trying to ship from wherever they're being mined or where the forests are being cleared. Shipping those to places where they can be processed becomes much easier with the railroad. Not to mention the ability to bring even more people into the state and increase sort of that population. So why do these particular industries sort of grow so much? Once more, going back to the previous question, demand. There was such a high demand for everything that these industries were producing that it really was just a question of how sort of efficient can you be in collecting it, because there's going to be sort of a insatiable market that's going to be really sort of buying all of these products up. And of course, sort of the influx of new people, that population growth is very much going to allow these industries as well to be growing, because not only is there going to be the demand, but you need to be able to have enough workers and enough factories and enough employees in order to make the whole thing work. So you're going to need a whole bunch of people. And luckily, this time period is just going to coincide with that sort of population growth sort of naturally, but also through the process of increased immigration. And that's all going to come together to sort of create sort of the supply side, to help with the supply side for that very large demand that has sort of been created through these ongoing processes. What impact did the development of these industries have on how the state was developing? Of course, we already talked about how sort of population was very important as far as sort of fueling this growth, but it's also sort of a chicken and the egg kind of situation, because as these industries grew and expanded, sort of the idea that Minnesota was sort of a booming community or a booming state with lots of opportunities for people also is going to be a draw for more and more people coming in. So the population of the state grows immensely during the last half of the 1800s. And not only is it growing, but particularly it's growing in urbanized areas located around where a number of the industries like the flour milling and the sawmilling and so forth are occurring. So you see cities like St. Paul, like Minneapolis, like Stillwater, like Duluth, becoming larger, more urbanized settings. The population is growing very, very large in some of those compared to what they had been obviously sort of previous to this time period, is that sort of the manufacturing hub. So while a lot of these industries like lumbering and mining and the farming is taking place in sort of the greater Minnesota area, a lot of times the products are being shipped back to these urbanized areas for being manufactured or for being shipped out to other locations. So not only are sort of the industries themselves and the large people, sort of the concentrations of populations coming to these various areas, it sort of has a cause and effect, ripple effect really, for a entire service industry that's going to be building up around this concentration of people. So when you have a lot of people, you need things like schools, you need things like churches, you need things like grocery stores, you're going to be needing hotels. The more people there are, the more of these sort of ancillary activities you're going to need, and with more sort of industrialization that you're seeing, you're eventually going to be seeing an increase for things like clothing, sort of basic necessities that need to be sort of produced on a large scale for a large number of people. So there's going to be just sort of, not just sort of ancillary service industries, but sort of ancillary production industries also forming and developing around these large population centers. So that's definitely going to be another way how the economically and just sort of the variety of the kind of industries and services that you're going to see in the state massively expand. And I'd say maybe the biggest is sort of the connection that Minnesota is going to form to both the national and the global economies. Because there was this incredibly high demand, and because Minnesota was able to produce so much of it, whether it was through the inclusion of the railroads, whether it was through shipping, that increasingly Minnesota is going to be connected and brought into this national and even global economic processes. We talked about how Minnesota sort of being a hub between the East Coast and the West Coast with the railroads becomes very sort of advantageous for it, and is going to lead for a lot of possibilities as far as sort of making money, but also as just sort of interconnecting with sort of that sort of global economic processes that are very much expanding globally at this point in time. So those are all various ways that the state is really going to be looking different if you look at how the state looked in 1870 as opposed to how the state's going to look in 1900. These are going to be a lot of the things that are going to make the city look much more, or the state look much more populated, much more urbanized, much more industrialized, and very much a period of great change. Is what we're seeing occurring here. Hey, congratulations! You are a time traveler and have the ability to go back in time and have a conversation with one historic individual now that you learned about this week. Please answer the following questions. And yeah, I thought the class did a very good job with this. Some of the sort of key people that the class picked up on and wanted to talk to were James J. Hill, talking about the expansion of the railroad and the railroad industry in Minnesota, Cadwallader Washburn and sort of what he did with the flour milling industry. Jay Cook, someone brought up. E.V. Small, who is part of our document exercise, someone wrote about him. And there's a lot of curiosity, particularly about sort of how they achieved the level of success that that they did. Why they sort of chose Minnesota, or why they wanted to sort of make this the fields that they went into, where they got the inspiration for some of the innovations that they went to. And a lot of people had fun sort of pointing out what the economy in Minnesota looks like today. The fact that Minnesota is still in a lot of ways sort of a economic leader in a lot of industries, even though those industries have sort of changed since the time of the likes of Hill and Washburn and Cook. But that we're still in a lot of ways sort of tied into the national and global economies that they sort of helped pioneer. And also, sort of thinking about just how some of these industries have changed, looking at James J. Hill and sort of how railroads function and work today versus how they did then. Would he be happy about that? Would he be sad that they're not sort of as important as they had once been, even though in other portions of the world and other places in the world they're still sort of used to a much higher degree? So yeah, a lot of people had good questions. I'm not going to go too far in depth here, since a lot of these are sort of very personal that people went off of. But as long as you sort of chose one of these important prominent figures from the chapter and had a nice little conversation discussion with them, you pretty much got full points here. Do you notice any downsides or potential drawbacks to these large industries that were being created? So whenever you have this very rapid expansion and this level of sort of drastic and dramatic change that we see during the last half of the 1800s here, whenever you see that, there's always going to be its downsides. There's always going to be some people who are better well served by these changes and some people who are not very well served by these changes. So while on the surface it sounds like, hey, this was a great time, we like the effects that this eventually is going to have on the state as far as sort of its growth. It's important to note that this is going to be coming at a cost to individuals, to the environment, and that there's going to be some people who can very, I'd say easily say, hey, yes, some parts of this are great, but some parts of this might not be so good. One group who is definitely saying this throughout this time period are going to be farmers. In a lot of ways, farmers were under pressure, even though this was sort of a booming, growing industry, particularly those sort of small farmers who came in and grabbed land as part of the Homestead Act and shortly thereafter, found it really, really tough, a really, really tough life. The prairie was very hard to get through. It required sort of advanced tools and technology to cut through it because the root systems of the prairie, as discussed in some of our sort of earlier videos, are very, very dense. And while the soil underneath is really, really rich and good for agriculture, it takes a lot to actually get it to work for you. And it's a lot of hard work. Also, there's a lot of pressure on the farmers, whether it is, so you have a crop of some type, how do you get it to market effectively to still be able to sort of make profit off of it? And there's also going to be some sort of ecological disasters that happen during this time period. Droughts, harsh winters, and grasshopper plagues. There was the article in the grasshopper plagues that you read about, where essentially for months on end, essentially these large grasshoppers or locusts would come in and pretty much eat anything that was edible. So people's entire crops got eaten. If you left laundry outside, they'd eat your clothes. Anything that was potentially edible, these sort of swarms and swarms of vicious grasshoppers would eat up. And of course, I mean, if you're a farmer and you're depending upon your crops to survive through the winter and to sell and to make money, and suddenly these grasshoppers come along and eat everything, you've got essentially nothing left. Unfortunately, these farmers are going to find a very sort of unsympathetic government that is this they are dealing with. There's very little actual sort of productive relief taken for these farmers, so a number of them had to just sort of give up and abandon their homes and their farms because they could no longer make a living doing it. The governor at the time essentially sort of called for a day of prayer to sort of pray that the grasshoppers went away, while not actually really doing anything. They did try to sort of fund some innovations, kind of gimmicks to collect and catch these grasshoppers, which were never going to be working on the scale that would actually sort of make a dent when you're dealing with hundreds, millions, possibly billions of these nasty grasshoppers. And sort of to compound this process, even if these farmers did survive these challenges, they oftentimes ran into very sort of predatory practices by the railroads or the milling companies that they are working with, which essentially had monopolies. The railroads, I mean, if the railroad came by your house or close to, where your farm was, and you wanted to get your crops into the city to be sold, essentially you would have to sell your crops to the railroad, who would then sort of resell it on their behalf. And a lot of times the railroads weren't very honest in this. They had sort of their own scales for weighing your grain that were tipped in their favor, so they weren't sort of giving you fair prices. Also, they could just sort of set the price, right? Saying, well, I'm the only person you can sort of realistically sell to, so we're going to tell you how much we're going to pay for your wheat or for your produce. So there's a lot of resentment on the part of these small farmers towards these these large railroads, and the milling companies as well certainly did not help by, of course, trying to purchase this wheat as cheaply as they could in order to make as much profit as they could. So it made it increasingly difficult for small farmers to really realistically make it. And in the long run, it was sort of these bonanza farms that were sort of large corporate interests that were owned a lot of times by the railroad people or by the milling companies or by people who are going to be able to sort of make profit all along the way, who was going to be profiting off of that. So for a lot of farmers, a lot of the sort of small farmers, they have to end up either selling their land to these larger companies, moving into a town or a more urban area, and trying to find something different. So definitely a lot of small farmers didn't feel like they were very well served by the direction that everything was going. Also, a lot of time these industries were very exploitive of workers. This was during a time period when there really were no protections for workers. A company could ask you to essentially work as long as they wanted to, for as many hours a day as they wanted to. There were very few, if any, safety standards. You can look at the explosions in the mills, for example, the 1878 Washburn mill explosion to see this, but even just working around large heavy equipment with not a lot of safety precautions, or in the lumbering industry, the milling industry, the mining industry, all these incredibly dangerous work environments with very few safety standards or precautions. And essentially, if you got hurt, there was no safety net. There was, no money for you to get. A company could just fire you if you got hurt because, hey, you couldn't work anymore, and essentially would say, too bad for you. So there's really nothing for workers to fall back on. Also, because there was so many people moving into the state and such a large supply of labor, that meant that a lot of these companies could keep employment really, or keep their wages really, really low, because they knew that, well, if you don't want to work for this incredibly low price, there's 10 people outside our door who are going to work for that price. So either you work for, wages that are barely enough for you to survive on, or you can go in and kick the can and not make anything. Was a lot of time the sort of attitude that they had. And very much sort of workers are going to feel that the owners of these industries do not have their best interests in mind, that they're sort of being treated as very disposable commodities in this process, and is going to also, just like the farmers, start building up a lot of resentment. So are the laborers and the people who are having to sort of be the bottom rung, and then the people who are fueling and driving most of these industries and doing most of the work, a lot of times are receiving the fewest benefits from that work. A lot of people also brought up the impact on the environment, how the farming really destroyed the prairie, this sort of incredible natural ecosystem that had been surviving for thousands of years is almost entirely destroyed within our state and converted into those agricultural lands. Very, very small amount of our original prairie is still surviving. Deforestation, these large swaths of white pine that had dominated large portions of the state were almost entirely cut down and decimated. And this is going to lead to a lot of other problems for the environment. Like wildfires, for example. The fact that, when you clear cut an area, you don't take all the wood with you. You only sort of take the wood that you want, which a lot of times leaves massive barren areas that have a lot of wood that's getting really, really dry and prime for forest fires. And if a fire gets started, there's nothing to break it. These wide open areas is just going to fuel on essentially this sort of dried out wood for miles upon miles and turn into these incredibly large firestorms. That's what happened in 1894 around Hinckley, Minnesota, where you had just an entire wall of fire that swept across thousands and thousands of acres, eventually killed 418 people, and really created a huge risk for people who are working in the industry or living in areas where there was a lot of this lumber going on. Looking at the mining industries, you have problems with mine runoff and pollution. Across the board, as more industry comes in, you see it impacting air quality and water quality. So the environment is going to be impacted through this process as well. More on the business side, you also see sort of the issue of monopolies forming. We already talked about this a little bit with the railroads, how the railroads really sort of had the upper hand on farmers that they were engaging with, and could really sort of set their own prices and enact business practices that were certainly not fair to the people that they were engaging with, because essentially they had all of the power and the chips on their side of the table. You really see this in the mining companies as well. Quite often, and this is another reason why the workers get so upset, is you'd have a situation where essentially a mining company would own an entire town. So if you were a worker for the mine, you had to live in a house that the mine built and provided for you. You had to shop at a store that the mining company stocked with all of its products, so they could essentially set all the prices in that store and sort of price gouge you for living there. And pretty much try to sort of control all your purchasing and make sure that all the money that they give you, you're essentially just giving right back to them. So a lot of very manipulative business practices here. And of course, if you're a miner, what are you going to do? I mean, if you're living in a town where the only store is the company store and the next store is 100 miles away, it's not like you can just pack up and go somewhere else. And at the same point in time, if you lose your job, it means you also lose your house. So if a mining company wants to, essentially treat you however they want, they know that you're going to have to put up with a whole hell of a lot, because you're essentially going to be losing everything if they choose to end your employment, or if you can't work for them anymore. And they know this, and sometimes there's even examples of them hiring people, telling them that they're going to pay them a certain rate for working, moving them to one of these towns out in the middle of nowhere, moving their entire family, setting them up, and then when they get to the job saying, well, I know we said we're going to pay you one amount, but now we're going to pay you a different amount, a lower amount. And essentially, the workers are in no position to argue with this, because, they've essentially uprooted their entire life, moved to the middle of nowhere, have no money essentially to move back, and the company's now able to essentially do this very predatory hiring practice to get them to work for a cheaper amount. So there's all sorts of issues going on at this point in time, that while these industries are growing and making a lot of money for a lot of people, there's a lot of people who are also feeling like they're not being very well served through this process. And this is kind of a preview for what we're going to be seeing in a couple weeks here, as both the farmers and labor across the state are going to start organizing themselves to push back against some of these things that they view as being problematic for them and not being in their best interest, and that's going to see the creation of a lot of political parties and political movements, and eventually it's going to lead to the Farmer Labor Party, which ultimately sort of becomes one of the most effective third parties in the country in political history, really. So very interesting how you sort of see the beginnings of this process here with this rapid expansion during this time period. Moving on to our primary source, looking at E.V. Small and his impressions of the Minnesota flour mills. Question number 1, why was E.V. Small so impressed with Minnesota's flour mills? What about them did he see as revolutionary? And he was very impressed by the ability to essentially use innovation to turn around, which had been a pretty small, kind of stagnant industry, into essentially what became a world-leading industry. As he describes at one point in time, he said it was the wonderful aggregation of delicate and ingenious mechanical processes, from the water power at the turbines to the purifiers and the grinders. He also goes into detail as far as what some of this technology is that so impressed him. The dust collectors, to make sure there weren't going to be any more of those explosions. The middling purifiers, the gradual reduction process, the iron rollers, all of this that made spring wheat, which had previously essentially been unusable in the creation of flour, into sort of the highest quality flour that you could make. The process, as he also describes, is sort of separating the husk from the small hard berry of the spring wheat, which left the highest quality flour. He also describes just how the scale of the flour milling impressed him. He says that 266 railroad cars a day were able to be essentially processed. 266 railroad cars of wheat, that is, were able to be processed in the mills in Minneapolis. He also goes on to say Minneapolis ground 24 million bushels of wheat last year and expects to grind 30 million this year. So looking at sort of the large process and the fact that they're shipping this wheat throughout the country and globally as well. And definitely the sort of ability to just rebuild the mills after the disasters of that they encountered, whether it was the troubles and difficulties they experienced early on with trying to actually utilize and use spring wheat, or whether it was the explosions that they had. But the ability, as he says, to sort of rebuild bigger, safer, and better each time was one more thing that he was very much impressed with. So what factors does E.V. Small believe helped lead to flour mill's success? Certainly he goes into detail about the innovation, and we talked a lot about that in question 1, how he thought that the innovation to create this new type of flour and mass produce it was very much leading to the success of the industry and of these mills. He also gives a lot of credit to geography. For example, he says, for favorable conditions for grinding wheat, no place in the world can compare to Minneapolis. It's nearby where the wheat is actually being grown and produced in Minnesota and the Dakotas and Nebraska. So very, very geographically, located close. Also, a lot of rivers for transportation and for power to actually transport that stuff. And more importantly for transportation, he mentions railroads several times. And what's more, than the importance of those railroads as far as taking an industry, which would have been, relatively only locally geared prior to this time period. Without the railroad, it's very much impossible to see the flour mill in Minnesota, or the flour milling process, becoming as big as it eventually becomes if there wasn't that ability to quickly ship these projects. Question number 3, what impact did E.V. Small see the mills having on Minnesota? At one point in time, he talks about how the population poured into Minnesota and Dakota. Railroads were built, towns sprang up as if by magic, and the bare plains were turned into wheat fields. So seeing how the impact of sort of this demand is fueling the rapid increase in the wheat farming industry, and how the towns and the railroads are following right along with this process. You also see him essentially sort of referencing urbanization, right? He talks about how there's 26 mills in this one location, and you, very much from sort of the images that you see there, you can see that it's obviously the workers and the people sort of supporting the milling industry are going to be built up around that as well. He also mentions the climate, which I kind of think he means just sort of the atmosphere of the state. He says the climate is healthful and invigorating, and it possesses an enterprising, intelligent, and an innovative population. So saying kind of the innovation from the mills is it's sort of partially inspired by this climate, but also I think he's saying it's adding to it as well, and adds to this sort of atmosphere of sort of healthful industry, if you want to think about it that way, for the state, which certainly is a very sort of glowing, rosy way to view industrialization. We already talked about some of the downsides to it, but E.V. Small is very much interested here in focusing on sort of the positive aspects that this industrialized process is having here in the flour milling industry.